Yo, 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 what is up? It's Cloverdale. And today we're back. We're breaking up all night. Well, we're not breaking it up. We're breaking it down. I'm showing you how I wrote my tune with Baba No Baby. Anyways, you know how it goes. If you missed the last video where I kind of break down some of my writing process and go over how I wrote the drums, you can click on that here. But if you think your drums are already banging as fuck and you don't need to look at that, that's fine. We're talking about the kick and the bass today, and diving into how I made those. So let's just look at those. We got this. Let's. Honestly, like that could be the track right there. That could be the track. So the kick is the first thing that I throw down on any track, and the kick sample is so important. So I stress this so much. Like, if the kick isn't sounding great, swap out the sample, swap out the sample, swap out the sample, swap it out until you get something that is sounding great. The things that are super important when you're picking a kick: the kick length and the kick pitch. Those are the most important things that I should emphasize here. In this case, I picked a kick that I saw was tagged as A sharp, and the reason I picked a kick in A sharp, this song isn't in A sharp. This song, I'm pretty sure, is in. Let's just take a quick look. Wow, this song is in D sharp. Is my root note. So, but why am I picking a kick in A sharp? A sharp is going to be the fifth. And so what I mean by that is, if you know your music theory, that means it is 7 semitones up from the root note. And that is basically a power chord. That is going to be something that is like working very harmonically with your root note. It's always going to work. And the reason why I put my kick drum almost like, if I'm using a tonal kick, if I pitch it up 7 semitones, so I pitch it at the fifth, it's going to be in key, but it also creates a bunch of separation between that main sub frequency that the kick is hitting and the main sub frequency that the bass is hitting. And so they're going to be separate. They're going to kind of be punching at different frequencies, but still in key. But that's kind of what's going to create a little bit of back and forth action, which is what we're really aiming for in our tracks, to make them really dancey. So let's load up this kick and let's just take a look and I'll show you what I mean. If we load up a Spectrum and we open it up right here and we hit play, I can see here where the main sub fundamental is hitting on this kick drum. It's right here, this big spike. Anytime you see a big spike like that, you know, that's going to be a note. And if I look down here on Spectrum, this is a major tip for if you're dealing with any sort of sample or sound or whatever. As I hover along here, this is showing me which note my cursor's hovering over. So if I hover over this like peak right here, it is at A sharp, which is great. You know, I know it's at A sharp. But if I, now if I load up my basses and I'm taking a look at those, you can do this on an EQ as well. You don't necessarily need a Spectrum. That's hitting a D sharp. So they're different frequencies. They're separated a little bit, and that's going to add a bunch of clarity to those elements, right? So that is talking about the pitch of the kick. And I use both, tonal kicks. In this case, this kick has a tone to it. And you can kind of hear it, and most importantly, you can see it. It's very clear. You can see that subtone. And then the other thing is the length. And I control the length of kick drums 2 different ways. More often than not, I will just, take a kick and, early on in the process, maybe shorten it this way, And if you find you have a kick that is already too short, it's kind of going to be a little hard to lengthen it. So I almost always pick kicks that are too long and shorten them. That's because I kind of have the ability to do that, versus if I pick a short kick, I can't really lengthen it. So food for thought there. The other way that I shorten kicks, and this is for when I'm a little lazier and I don't want to like copy and paste things across, and shout out my boys Keep Six for showing me this trick, is using LFO tool, but in reverse. So I have it, playing every kick, but it's just shortening it this way, and that way I can kind of shorten the kick if I want it really tight. I could do that, or I could have it longer. This is basically volume controlling that. And this tool is actually great because I can kind of like really dial in how I want that to shape and pitch and whatnot. So that is how I shorten kick drums, and the length is so important, because if you have a really long kick drum, then you're not leaving as much space for the bass to kind of fill up in that space. And if you have a really short kick drum, maybe that's not like as punchy and slamming on the dance floor. You want to find something that is in the middle that's working for you, that fits your music and your bass lines the best. And I actually read somewhere at one point, and I guess this kind of makes sense. If you have a longer kick drum, bass lines that generally are like shorter and pluckier are going to kind of cut through a little better than if you had a big, long, rolling type bass line. And then if you have shorter kick drums, kind of the rolling bass line can work a little better. And that it makes sense. So a little something else to note, I have a trigger here set up, and this is set up in my template, so I don't need to do this every single time I load up Ableton. And if you're using Kickstart or LFO Tool or Volume Shaper or any of those plugins that are sidechain plugins to duck out the volume, I recommend you do this rather than just having it in sync mode. It's crazy how many people I get on lessons with or projects they're sent to me, and they just have it on sync mode, which is great. And that just means it's, LFO Tool or Kickstart or whatever is just going to duck every single beat no matter what. But if I do it this way and have a trigger set up, what I can do is I can route this MIDI information so in this case, how I did this is if you go up to Instruments, External Instrument is what you're going to do. And then I just created a rack or a group, right? So I'll just, I'll duplicate this and show you what I mean. So all you do, add an external instrument, you route your MIDI to wherever. In this case, I was going to do the kick, right? So kick, and then I make sure that it's going to LFO Tool. And then on LFO Tool or on Kickstart or on Volume Shaper, there's going to be a MIDI retrig option. And so I just want to have that set to envelope mode. And that means every time that this MIDI note happens, it's going to trigger LFO Tool to happen. And when this doesn't happen, it's not going to duck. So when I delete these kicks and I have these sections in the middle here, it's not going to keep ducking out. And this saves you from, I know tons of people that will go and just add automation and automate on and off. And I definitely used to do that. This is a way easier, better option. And as I said, I just set it up in my template, so I don't need to do that every single time. And one more thing, actually, once you have that set up and you have a bunch of other channels, you can just group this. So Command G, or you can right click and group it. And then I can just duplicate this here, and I can now route this to something else. I know it's a little bit of work, but I find it's worth it. I also highly recommend doing your sidechain using one of those methods versus using a compressor. With a compressor, you can get it to work great, but it is kind of hard to dial in the release time sometimes. And what you can, it's hard to, say this was, you can't really dial in these curves or control this super easily. So I definitely do recommend, grabbing either LFO Tool, Shaperbox, Kickstart. There's probably another handful of other ones that are just volume automation tools. You can have a lot more control that way, especially if you're writing house or techno. Okay. That being said, the only other major thing I added to this kick drum is Kick Tweak. In this case, I'm not really doing too much. Kick Tweak's a fun little plugin. It basically just has these 10 presets that either are saturation or transient shaping and compression, and each one kind of sounds just a little different. In this case, I'm not even adding much to it. Very subtle. Cool little plugin. If you're looking for just some more beef to some of your kick samples, I would recommend it, and it's kind of cheap. I use it pretty often. Okay, on to the bass and just how I like to set up my side chain, how I like to set things up for success. So before I open up anything, before I even get going, in my template that I have that it loads up, I have some serum channels and I have them grouped to a bases group. And then I have that group running to my sidechain bus. Sidechain bus is at the top. And this bus is sort of like a catch-all sort of sidechain. And the reason why I do it this way is for workflow only. There's, if I wanted to, I could go and sidechain everything independently, and that's great. But in this case, I there's so many things that I'm just like, okay, I just want them to have like the biggest, chunkiest sidechain, and that's what this is looking like here. It's a really long sidechain, and it's probably around a similar length to what the kick is here, right? And so I can look at both of these LFO tools here and kind of inversely line them up and say, okay, if this is how long my kick drum is, then this is my sidechain. Sick, cool. I can really dial in how much separation I have between the two. I could line this up actually below even, and you could really see. And this way, I visually know, and I can listen and say, all right, those two are working great between the kick and the bass. And if I want a little more sidechain, losing the groove there. So somewhere in the middle there, sounding great. Okay, so let's talk about the basses for a second. Bass line, in this case, again, from the get-go, I wanted it to be a really sort of driving type track. And so I knew I already wanted to include a bunch of 16th notes in the MIDI pattern. And when I'm writing bass lines, another thing, I do this every single track, and I think it's super beneficial, is I'll write one, and I'll write the kick, and I'll write this, and I'll be like, okay, this is sounding good. I'll take that same bass, I'll duplicate it, and I'll delete the MIDI, and maybe I'll change the patch, and I'll write a completely new bass. And then I'll do that again, and I'll write another completely new bass, and then I'll do that again, and I'll write another completely new bass, and I'll write maybe like 6 or 7 bass lines. And after I've written all of those bass lines, I'll go back and just solo each one and kind of live with it for a second and try and decide, okay, cool, like it. All right, good. And usually there's one that stands out being like, oh, dude, that's obviously the best one. And oftentimes it's not the first one. And what's great about doing it that way is you can really sort of make conscious decisions about like A-B comparing, saying this one, versus if you just have one MIDI note and you're like, okay, I like this bass line, but it's not right. And you just kind of are constantly changing the MIDI notes over and over and over and over again until you find something that you like, that eventually you might land somewhere that you like, but you can't then go back and ask yourself, wait, do I like this more than what I had before? So as soon as you have something that you like, just duplicate it. Move on, duplicate it, move on, duplicate it, move on. I do this for everything, not just bass lines, but I'll do it for leads and for vocals and for drums and whatever, and then go back and say, okay, which one is the best? Which one do I genuinely really, really like? And I think it forces me to come up with new ideas and forces me to kind of be more creative rather than just kind of like being cool with the first thing that I put on the page. So I would have definitely done that in this process as well, and landed on this bass line here. We'll do it with the kick too. Let's take a look at what's going on in the actual notes here. So a few things to notice. One, the notes all are sort of like different lengths. Some are longer, some are shorter, some are, and also we got some velocity changes down here too. Definitely play around with those things. Play around with note length. That is how you're going to get interesting, exciting patterns. Other than that, like this is pretty much just playing, 16th notes. There's a couple of notes missing here and there. But for the most part, it's pretty much just playing 16th notes. Actually, yeah, the only notes that are missing are going to be where the kick is hitting, and so you wouldn't even really hear those ones anyways because of the sidechain. I often am just using this scale feature, and we'll go D sharp and minor, I'm assuming. No, not minor. Probably Phrygian. That's it. So I write, this is my secret, and I'm telling you guys right now, if you want your music to sound cooler than everybody else's, stop writing it in minor and start writing it in Phrygian. My secret's out. I told the world. Do what you will with it. Anyways, the only difference between minor and Phrygian just means that the second note, in this case, if it was minor, we'll unscale it. It would go from E sharp. That's so weird when they say E sharp, which is actually just an F, but they're saying it because it's D sharp. Anyways, F down to E. It's just that second note just drops down one semitone. That's all that is. Anyways, this song's written in Phrygian. So many of my songs are written in Phrygian. Okay. Oops, except this was E. There we go. That's the bass line. Let's take a look at the patch that I've used to do it. In this case, I do recommend to everybody, load up on some presets. I don't have tons, but I find some that are working good for you, that fit your style. And if you really don't like sound designing, this is the best way to do it. And then what I want you to get really good at, what everybody should be good at, is taking a sound in a synth and getting it to where it needs to be in the song. 90% of the presets in here aren't really going to work just out of the box. You have to kind of work with them and get them to work. And 90% of the time, what you're doing there is you're working with the decay time, your sustain, your release. So basically the note length and how it's playing. That's all down here. And then the filtering and the effects. So a lot of presets come loaded with tons of effects. Maybe this came with reverb or something. Maybe it came with delay and whatnot. If you're working on a bass, I almost recommend always to just take some of that stuff off. Try and get it to a pretty basic tone before you start adding a bunch of stuff. Let me go and turn off all of... it's just EQs anyways. We'll turn off all that. There's some more stuff here. We'll turn off all this. And I'll kind of just walk through my brain's thought process if I can remember it. So the initial sound, I would have kind of dialed in this decay time so that it's much tighter, dialed in my release time, and then dialed in my frequency of the filter. In this case, I automated the filter cutoff. Which I also highly recommend all the time. Automate your synths, automate your basses so that they have movement, so that they kind of carry energy forward. In this case, let's pull up the automation for the cutoff filter. It's, each time it's going up, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up. And listen to how that sounds with everything. And that contrast between up, down, up, down, up, down, that's so much of how you're going to kind of keep carrying your track forward, building energy, building excitement and hypeness. Having things open up like that is a great way to do that. In this case, I just used the filter, but in some other instances, maybe I would automate the decay time so that over time, maybe it rings out a little more too, right? So that would sound more like this. It's getting a little more extreme there, which is probably why I didn't do it. But in breakdowns and stuff like that, you might want to automate the decay time. There's so much you can automate, and I highly recommend doing that. Getting wild, have it go. In terms of processing on this one, let's take a look at the processing on this one. So in terms of processing on this one, we got a little bit of width. I actually add this to all my basses. I think a long time ago, someone was like, this is very common knowledge to keep your basses and your subs in mono, which is true, and you can kind of get some phase cancellation stuff. But I try to make sure I correct that later on. But I always do love having some stereo information in my low mids, like in my sort of 100 hertz to 500 hertz sort of range. And I often get that using this hyperdimension. I don't like using the dimension because I find the dimension adds some weird sort of like room tone to the bass almost. Sometimes it works, but most of the time I like to keep things pretty clean. And I use this hyper thing. And this works very similarly to a chorus, but it's almost like a simpler chorus. A chorus is kind of adding a ton of different voices and can get all wild and detuned. This one, I'm basically just adding 4, and I'm not even turning the mix up too much. Let's just A/B that really quickly so you can hear the with and without. So that's without, and that's with. So it's just adding a little bit more, presence. And what it's doing is adding some stereo image to that sound, which is bringing it, making it clearer for you to hear. Give that simple thing, give that a go on any sort of basses that you're working on right now. Now, one thing to note, if you are going to do that at some point down the line, whether it's, in the group or somewhere, I recommend doing a mid-side EQ. And so if you've never done this before, you can go into any sort of EQ, and there's stereo, which is basically EQing both left and right exactly the same. There's left and right, which EQs each left channel and the right channel differently. And then there's mid-side, and mid-side is probably the most useful. And what that is saying is it's saying, I will EQ the middle, everything that is mono, everything dead in the middle, differently than I will EQ everything that is spread over to the left and to the right. And so the sides here, and I can just edit each one differently, the sides here, I would want to roll off anything, down here. There's not too much, but maybe just roll off some of that. But this is the good stuff right here. Some stereo information around 100 hertz. That's the good stuff right there. Okay, let's keep looking at, so from there, little EQ work. And the reason why, and you'll see this on all my projects, that I'll have an EQ like this, and then I'll have an EQ like this, and you'll notice this goes to the group here, and I'll have another EQ, and then another EQ, and then another EQ. And this is because when I'm working on my tracks, I'll get this, and, say this was the first EQ, and I'm like, okay, this is sounding pretty good. I don't really want to fuck it up. I don't want to mess around with this because I like how this is sounding. And I know what I want to do in my head. I want to kind of duck out more of the mids. But if I start playing around with this too much, it might kind of fuck up how I already kind of like it sounding. So instead of messing around with it more, I'm just going to add another one, keep ducking those out. And that's always my mentality. I don't really want to fuck up what I got, so I'm just going to kind of keep trucking along and adding new things. So some compression, quite a bit of it. I honestly just used this OTT because it was like the first one that I ever had back from before when I was on FL Studio. Mind you, the other one also works pretty much exactly the same. And then I EQ'd up, bringing up some of the high end, I guess. Saturn is brilliant on bass lines. Brilliant. And reason why is it's multiband, which is sick. And I also find that these models here sound really good on low-end information versus a plugin like, say, Decapitator, I find doesn't do as good of a job doesn't do as good of a job saturating low-end. It almost kind of can distort it and make it sound a little fuzzy and boxy and a little bit too much. I find Saturn does a much better job of distorting basses and low ends. And you can do a lot of shaping and sculpting with this. In this case, I actually did not. I just added a little bit of gentle saturation. But I often am playing around either with warm tube or clean tape and kind of maybe adding, my sub I have set to clean tape, and my mid-range here I have set to warm tube, and maybe I push my mid-range up a little more, and I EQ that all different. I can really shape a bass line a lot with Saturn, and it is a secret weapon in getting a bass line to kind of sit and fit with everything else. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if your kick and your bass aren't sitting well together, it's generally about one kind of punching in different frequencies where the others are punching, and you kind of want them to be balanced. You want them to be hitting in the right spots, that they're both complementary to each other. That the kick is filling up one range, and then all of a sudden the bass comes in and kind of fills in that almost that same space. And so to get that, if they're not working, it's almost always EQing, and this what you're doing here by saturating one thing and pulling this down and pulling this up, you're kind of EQing and sculpting in a way, even though saturation is not EQing, but we're basically drawing attention to certain areas inside of the mix. So let me go back to what we initially had here, which was pretty much just this gentle saturation. Okay, and then look at me, more EQing, more saturation, adding more drive. Sausage fattener, which is adding more saturation. Look at it, 1%, not really doing much. It's just adding a little bit more drive to it. Some filtering that I automate at some point. Imager, this is great. Let's take a look at this. So let's look here. I always want to make sure that my basses are filling up sort of the right range. I don't want them to be crazy wide. I don't want them to go from here to here, but I don't want them to be mono, right? So I'm usually pulling up an imager to take a look, and what it's showing right now is really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for kind of like a thin little sausage of an image, right? A little bit of width, but it's still pretty strong in the middle. And here's another spot where I can double check and make sure that low end, below 100, is mono. But then here in this mid-range, maybe I'll boost it up, and the highs boost it up even more, and kind of give it some stereo, and that will bring it some presence and bring it to life. Boom, 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 boom. Soothe. Now, how I'm using Soothe right here is actually pretty neat. I actually am running it in sidechain mode. If you have Soothe and don't and aren't doing this, man, this is one of the most powerful things Soothe has to offer. Let's load up the first drop here. Where are we? First drop. So what I have it doing is sidechained to the vocals. And so what that means is the vocals are being sent to Soothe, and then Soothe is analyzing the vocals and then ducking out just the frequencies where the vocals are playing out of the bass. And the reason I did that is because I felt like the vocals, if I turn Soothe off, I felt like the vocals and the bass were kind of clashing at times. But if I turn Soothe on here, listen to the vocal during that section. Listen to how clear it sounds after I turn Soothe on. So this is before. So it's opening up all of that space up here where that vocal sits, and just like giving it room to breathe so that the vocal and the bass aren't clashing. I use that technique all the time, especially with vocals. You want your vocals to feel really clear, and so I will, whether it's a lead or whether it's a bass or whatever, I want it to fit and to gel with it. Look, more sausage fattening. I'm just driving it more. Wow, exciting. And more Saturn. What am I doing? Clean tape, kind of driving it more. Saturating it. Look at all these. And as I'm going, the reason, maybe I don't need, how many saturators do I have this in the end? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 saturators on this bass. Do I need that many? Could I have done it with 1? Yes, sure. But it's a process, and in my process, I loaded this one up, and then I EQ'd it a little more, and then I'm like, okay, what does it need now? And I'm almost like thinking about like kind of what is happening now versus like trying to go back on some things a little bit. I also try not to I say that, but I also try to really kind of not overcomplicate things. Keep things as simple as I can. I do have a layer on this bass, That's a kind of a high-end layer. You can see it's actually a duplicate of the exact same preset, but I have it EQ'd this way. And then I have texture on it. And what texture is, in this case, I think I'm just using it as a white noise. That's it, exactly. So texture is a really, really cool little plugin. Basically, I have it set up to just send out white noise. And I have it to, gating to this little sound, basically just adding white noise. So this is before it. Texture works similarly to erosion. You can basically select all these different, sounds in here. Maybe I could do crash. And if you listen now, it's actually a crash. There's all kinds. And I can control the decay time. But I just want the basic white noise. Definitely a super cool plugin to check out if you're looking to add some dirt and texture to your sounds without actually fucking up the sound. Like I'm not, distorting the sound at all. It just now sounds way more distorted. And so that white noise, adding on top of the bass, without it, there's no presence on that bass. It's kind of dull. And now it's cutting through. And if you listen in the whole mix of everything, we'll do a little A/B. So this is without it. And with it. Subtle, but just adding more presence, adding some life and character, bringing that bass to life. Okay, that is the bulk of the bass processing. I think the major takeaways are: write a bunch of different bass lines, try out a bunch of different patches, try and find patches that work well with the kick drum, try and find that are kind of hitting in the right frequencies with your kick. Don't be afraid to swap out your kick drum a bunch of different times to try and get things to work. Diving in and doing some nitty-gritty EQ work on both of them, because at the end of the day, it's gonna be EQ work and a little bit of compression that are gonna kind of get things to lock super well. And of course, sidechain length of your drums, very, very important. That is, how I kind of got this one done. I'm going to be going over a bunch more in the future, sort of bass lines and kick techniques, because this is definitely the thing that I think a lot of producers feel like is the hardest part, and it is, and it's still sometimes the hardest part for me. So much of getting this area right and getting your kick and bass right is referencing other tunes. It's listening to your track on your studio monitors, on your headphones, bounce it out, listening to it in your car, in your friend's car, in every possible system you can listen to, and taking notes and saying, okay, it definitely sounds great in the studio, but in the car, the kick has too much sub. And so pay attention to that, go back and bring the, maybe bring the sub down, or maybe bring the bass down. Or maybe in this case, look at this. On my master, I have, it's ducking out a little bit. I don't know. At the end of the whole process, I was like, what? I still can't get this. This sub is just becoming a little bit too loud, a little bit too much. And so I just ducked it out with an EQ on the master. And and that was a decision that I made after playing it out live, after listening to it in the car. And I just overall was feeling like it was just too sub heavy. Pay attention to those things, make note of them, write them down, and then act accordingly. Don't just trust that it sounds great on your headphones or sounds great on your studio monitors, and then it's going to sound great everywhere. That is not the case, and it's not the case for anyone. So really do that. Reference your tracks. Listen to them on a million different things, especially your kick and bass. That is going to be what makes your kick and bass work and stand out. Is that don't overcompress, don't oversaturate. Keep things breathing, keep things lively. One other quick thing to note before we go: pay attention to the levels of your kick and your bass as well. So we have, let's solo these for a second. These over here show us our levels, and important to note that this number here is just a volume number. This is turning whatever input signal you have down by 4 dB, but the input signal, whatever this kick is playing, could be anything. And so to actually check the levels of any specific track, I recommend going in here, and these numbers here show us, where things are actually peaking, where things are actually hitting. So in this case, if I click them, it'll reset the numbers. And then if I hit play, it's saying, okay, this kick is peaking at 6.19, minus 6.19, and this one, the bass, is peaking at minus 6.75. That is perfect. I almost always, I want my kick to be the loudest thing in my track, but usually my bass line is only, within a dB or two quieter than that. In this case, the bass line's almost as loud as the kick. They're kind of balanced. But it'd be very rare for me to have a bass line that is louder than the kick. I don't think I have ever done that. The kick is almost always the loudest thing in your track. So as you're working, pay attention to this. Pay attention to the level, and make sure that things are balanced and things are working. Listen on a bunch of different systems, and hell yeah, you got this. Okay, on the next video, which you can watch right here, we're going to be covering the vocal processing on this track. Up all night with, my Baba No Baby literally came and just spit it in like half an hour, but we had a lot of fun processing the vocals, so we'll check it out there. Be sure to like and subscribe right here for a bunch of more content. Okay, bunch of links below if you want to join the Discord, or follow me on Twitter, or buy the High Octane sample pack, or all that goodies are in the description below. Love you guys. My name's Cloverdale. Bye.